All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Erin Curtis, and I work for the California Environmental Protection Agency, and we appreciate all of you joining us here for our stakeholder briefing regarding some very exciting news related to our climate budget for California. I will give you just a few parameters before we start. Once we get to the point where we have Q&A, we ask all of you to put your questions, if you have them, into the Q&A of the Zoom webinar, and we will handle making sure that we get answers to as many of them as we can. So once again, please use the Q&A to put your questions in once we get through listening to our speakers. And I will now pass it over to Lauren Sanchez, the Senior Climate Advisor for Governor Gavin Newsom.
Thanks so much, Erin. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes a todos. I'm Lauren Sanchez, the Governor's Senior Climate Advisor. And I just want to start by thanking all of you for joining today and for the tireless organizing, advocating, campaigning, and innovating you are all doing every single day. I'm so thrilled to be working for Governor Newsom in this role, fighting to protect Californians. And as I've shared with many of you already, I'm most excited about partnering with you all, our thoughtful and driven leaders across the movement. As the governor said this morning, standing in front of the ancient sequoias, there's something special about California. Our climate agenda has defined the nation's and the world's. Both the Biden administration's HFC action today and their clean car effort last month grew out of leadership from our great state. Last Tuesday, as we celebrated, the vast majority of Californians voted in support of our governor and his climate agenda. But we're also overwhelmed. We're inundated just by looking out the window and feeling the impacts of climate change. Drought emergencies declared in nearly every county, catastrophic wildfires burning across the state, exposing millions of Californians to unhealthy air. The hottest summer on record. The governor spoke about visiting the sequoias with his father. My immigrant father slept outside of his house this summer, sweltering under the Pacific Northwest heat dome. His childhood home stands on a street in Boyle Heights in East LA with no trees in sight. Our communities of color are suffering from extreme heat waves week after week. The recent IPCC report forcefully told us what we already know. Climate change is code red for humanity. Amid these unparalleled risks, Governor Newsom continues to take bold climate action. And today, with many thanks to and in partnership with our colleagues in the legislature, we unveiled the next phase in our state's battle against climate change. California is dedicating an unprecedented $15 billion to fighting this crisis. The governor also signed a raft of legislation that I know many of you worked on that protect communities and advance the state's climate and clean energy efforts, from drought and wildfire resilience measures to offshore wind and plugging abandoned wells. We were proud to be the first state to mandate that all new cars sold be zero emission by 2035. We pledged to conserve 30% of land and coastal waters by 2030, and we are proud to highlight that historically, over half of our climate investments have benefited disadvantaged communities and low-income Californians. After over 70 environmental and climate lawsuits against the Trump administration, we are so thankful to have a president in the White House who understands the urgency of this crisis. The governor recently led a 10-state coalition letter underscoring the need for climate investments in the reconciliation bill and in the infrastructure package currently being negotiated in DC. But we are not waiting for Washington, and we are not going to be able to do this alone. I want to thank Californians, especially our youth, innovative businesses and labor groups, nonprofits, the philanthropic community, farmers, firefighters, and so many others who have helped to create a better future for California. This is more than just the governor's budget and the legislature's budget. I hope you all see the communities you represent in today's action. Over the next 3 years, this $15 billion investment, the largest in state history, will combat catastrophic wildfires, support immediate drought action, race forward on our zero emission vehicle goals, and build an equitable and resilient California of the future. It's time to step up and meet this moment. Time to stop talking and do what is required to leave our children the livable planet they so deserve. This budget does just that. Over $15 billion to meet this moment. To provide more details on this unprecedented investment, we will now hear from a few of my tremendous partners in our climate fight. Karen Ross, Secretary of Agriculture, will detail our expanded support for sustainable agriculture and resilient food systems. Jared Blumenfeld, Secretary of Environmental Protection, will detail the emphasis on environmental justice and protecting public health by delivering clean air and safe and affordable drinking water. Wade Crowfoot, Secretary of Natural Resources, will provide an overview of climate-smart land management investments, such as those that reduce risks from wildfires, drought, extreme heat, and sea level rise. And Nuantara Key will cover the investments in actionable climate science, community capacity building, and community resilience. Over to you, Secretary Blumenfeld.
Thanks, Lauren. Really thrilled that the governor selected you. You've been doing an incredible job, and just really appreciate the emphasis you're bringing from equity to really thinking about how we accelerate our ambition. I also just want to give a huge thanks to each and every one of you participating today. We got a great group of 467 of you, and you all, as Lauren pointed out, make this happen. We wouldn't be in this place without you. And I'd say, as we think about this budget, it's kind of two big things. One is the budget ahead. And I know Lauren and team are kind of already thinking about what that looks like. And secondly, how we implement this budget collectively with you, how we think about framing some of those issues with you is going to be really critical. So I don't know, the jobs that we do are really tough. All of you do. Working in this space feels like every year just the number of emergencies accelerate, the number of Californians at risk grows. And so I think just the emotional toll it takes on us is something real, and I want to acknowledge. And at the same time, we need areas of hope. And this budget gives me hope. I mean, it really sends a clear message about what our investments are, what we need to do, and the rest of the world is watching. Really, California is a beacon of hope, and as much as we're not doing enough. And in order to do more, we need all of your help to show the way, to do it in a way that makes sense for all of us. So I think one of the biggest messages that California sends is that we're proving that our economic outcome and our economic growth and prosperity actually are improved by taking decisive action on climate, pollution, and equity. Our GDP between 2000 and 2019 grew by 63%, and our emissions per capita were reduced by 25% when it comes to climate pollution. Just last month, we added 55,000 jobs to our economy, which is 3 times the rate of the rest of the nation. So we're doing both the things, and that's, I think, what the world really is looking at. Like, how is California innovating, doing this work in a way that also grows our economy? And as each of you know, we're 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but we have an outsized impact if we can get this right. Getting this right means lifting up every community. Every community needs to feel the benefits. It can't just be folks that are well off that benefit from these programs. And that's really, I think, a large part of this budget. So we have, as Lauren mentioned, we, thanks to many of you, both in the automotive industry, who are really pushing zero emission vehicles. As the governor mentioned this morning, we have 34 electric vehicle manufacturers. We're very close on selling our millionth electric vehicle in the state. It's our #1 export. This budget puts significant funding, $400 million over 3 years, into Clean Cars for All, and other transportation equity programs, 500 million for clean truck, bus, and off-road equipment, 525 million for the Clean Vehicle Rebate Program. As you're going to hear from Karen, Secretary Ross, significant 363 million for farm vehicles, and particular pet peeve of mine, anyone who's ever talked to me will know, is leaf blowers. We even have money to help people make the transition to electric leaf blowers and other types of equipment like that. So literally every potential category of electrification we're looking at. The governor and Lauren have given very clear instruction that we really need to get to a place where electrifying everything that we possibly can as quickly as we can. But we can't do it without the voices of community members, people that have, in many cases that you represent, that have felt for way too long the impacts of racist policies around land use planning, zoning, enforcement. All these things have led to a place where your race in California today is a predictor of pollution. And in the world's 5th largest economy in 2021, that is completely unacceptable. And I think you'll see underpinned in every element of this budget is that environmental justice focus. So we have increased the environmental justice small grants program from 1.5 million a year to 25 million over 3 years. We really want to make sure communities have the capacity and the resources to influence programs like the Community Air Protection Program. AB 617 made sure that that is getting $320 million, all the way through programs like low income weatherization, where we're putting 65 million over the next 3 years, and rural programs that are similar, like 5 million for wood smoke reduction, which in rural communities has a big impact. As we heard from Lauren, the US Environmental Protection Agency and President Biden are taking action on hydrofluorocarbons and those super pollutants that are up to 70 times more potent than greenhouse gas emissions. We have 15 million in the budget to continue California's 20-year leadership on that program. And then a real focus and big amount of money for circular economy programs, looking at the really serious issues of litter, of trash in our oceans, of methane coming from our landfills, and working out a way to really think about not waste, but resource management in a way that we're using those materials. We're using a lot less of them. This is partly about climate change, but mainly it's about rampant overconsumption and waste of single-use products that actually is pretty appalling export of ours. When we think about what we're trying to export to the rest of the world, those single-use products are something that we really need to get a handle on. So significant money, 270 million going into those programs, everything from community composting to co-digestion of food scraps at wastewater treatment plants to 50 million for CalRecycle's market development loan programs. And as Lauren teed up, this wouldn't be complete in the drought context. We're going to hear from Wade and Karen more, but part of the historic drought that we have relates to drinking water. And as you've seen, the state board actions relating to curtailment and other actions they've been taking really talk about health and safety. We need to make sure we have water for our most vulnerable communities. And the governor has been from day one very focused on making sure that money exists. So wanted to spend 1 minute on what's happened in the last year. We've got 110 long-term solutions have been implemented for communities, actually benefiting 110,000 people in California. They've included water treatment and infrastructure improvements and 47 projects to consolidate smaller systems so that we can create the rate base and the technical ability to help those smaller systems survive. We've also initiated 15 mandatory water system consolidations, having been given that power from the legislature, thanks to many of your actions. We also initiated nearly 500 interim solutions during this time for everything from bottled water to hauled water deliveries to point of entry devices, helping more than 67,000 folks. So building on that, we have 1.3 billion additional money billion for drinking and wastewater infrastructure, especially targeted for small and disadvantaged communities. We have 100 million for dealing with the forever chemicals like PFAS and PFOA. And as you're going to hear, the depth and magnitude of the drought, for those of you who follow these issues, the state board on Tuesday had a hearing on this. Really, really difficult decisions that have to be made in the year ahead, especially if we're not in a place where we have water and rain and precipitation this year. So we have things in the budget like 400 million over 3 years for groundwater cleanup and water recycling, and 500 million for local drought projects, of which 200 million is dedicated to small communities. And then finally, thanks to many of your efforts, we have $1 billion, I mean, the numbers are astronomical, but $1 billion to cover drinking and wastewater arrearages that occurred during COVID, where communities were not able to pay for their waste or drinking water bills during that time. So our goal is to create resilient communities. Our goal is to reduce our greenhouse gas pollution wherever we can. And finally, 2 of our agencies, Department of Toxic Substance Control and Care Recycle, are out on the ground today in Grizzly Flats and in the Dixie Fire, actually leading cleanup efforts. Those cleanup efforts cost billions of dollars. Just want to thank those teams for the work that they do, but really to say that this huge investment that Lauren in broad brushstrokes articulated and that you're going to hear from the rest of the team is really about making sure we build a California for tomorrow that is resilient and also shows how we can reduce those emissions very, very fast, because we don't have a lot of time. And I'll end by thanking you for the next level of interaction around the next budget and how we implement these programs. And I will turn it back over to Lauren for the next speaker.
Thanks, Jared. I think we're headed over to Secretary Ross.
Okay, it's only my 20th Zoom call today. Sorry, folks, for that slight pause. Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Secretary Blumenfeld. And I'm looking forward to the questions that we'll be getting from our stakeholders. Thank you all for joining us. To say the last year and a half have been challenging in agriculture would be an understatement. But through pandemic, through last year's wildfires, and the real impact that climate change is having on our ability to produce food, and make sure that it's getting into the supply chain. Despite the many disruptions that we had, our farmers, our renters, and our farm workers continue to be there every day to make sure that all of us as Californians had access to healthy, nutritious California-grown food, fresh food, and that we were still able to ship it to our friends and neighbors across this country as there was more increased attention to my health, my nutrition, and what am I eating. I want to give a special thank you to Governor Newsom for his leadership on this budget. He challenged us all to really think about how can we truly make a difference. This is like generational funding that we're going to have. So let's use it to be transformative. And of course, appreciation to our partners in the legislature for making this budget a reality. I'm going to break mine into 2 different buckets. First of all, many of you may already be familiar with the suite of programs that we have under Climate Smart Agriculture. This is really about providing incentive grants to farmers and ranchers to help de-risk them, making some changes in their practices to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural operations, and most excitingly, being able to implement practices to draw down carbon, to be part of the solution by sequestering carbon. This budget proposes $915 million in total for our suite of climate smart agricultural programs, including $160 million for our Healthy Soils program, that ability to draw down carbon, $39 million for a new program, which is Farm Conservation Management Planning Grants and the technical assistance to help all farmers access this pot of money to do whole farm planning about all of the conservation programs they can do to really fight climate change and also to protect biodiversity. Of that $39 million, in the first year of this program, $7 million is prioritized to support those farmers who want to go through the transition period to achieve organic certification. We have $30 million for a new pollinator habitat program, which I'm excited about as part of our biodiversity and the 30 by 30 initiative. This will allow us to partner with state, local, and federal entities, in addition to our private landowners, to provide habitat and forage for those all-important pollinators. The program that Secretary Blumenfeld briefly mentioned at the ARB, which is the farmer program, this partners with farmers to replace older engines, older agricultural equipment that not only reduces greenhouse gas emissions, but has an almost immediate impact on improving the air quality. These dollars are focused on the San Joaquin Valley, and they make a tremendous difference. In addition to that is $180 million going to the Air Board to support alternatives to open field agricultural burning. We now have a target to reduce that burning and eliminate it over the next 3-year period. Continuing our methane reduction program, and I want to thank our partners in the dairy and the livestock sector for being such good partners in embracing this program for methane reductions. This is a combination of alternative manure management programs and dairy digesters, $80 million in total. In addition to that, this budget has $10 million for additional methane reduction research to better quantify what the real savings are and to look at additional new alternatives. The last program that's new to our Climate Smart Ag program is a sustainable California grown cannabis program to really partner with that sector to identify the best practices for their long-term sustainability. Shifting over to sustainable resilient food systems, a special call out to the first partner who I'm working with on our roadmap for farm to school programs, $60 million for our California Farm to School Incubator Program. This is our opportunity to use these investments to support all the farmers that had their markets impacted last year because of pandemic, support them in being able to be part of a local community food system, to get local farm fresh foods into our schools to improve the nutritional offering of our school lunch programs, but also to put an emphasis on food and agriculture and environmental literacy. A new program, a farm to community food hub program, is really going to focus on creating some efficient ways of aggregating and then distributing that farm fresh food into our local institutions and especially our schools. New program for urban agriculture, $12 million programs, that would be nice, $12 million to support urban farmers and community-based organizations who are working so hard to revitalize their urban farm programs to really increase access to local fresh produce. We have water efficiency and sustainable groundwater management programs. Our on-farm water use efficiency program SWEEP will have $100 million to dedicate to those farmers and ranchers who continually make this one of our most popular programs. To our partners at the Department of Water Resources, $300 million for sustainable groundwater management grants to really facilitate economic mitigation, planning at the local level, as well as implementation of projects that will help us achieve our sustainable groundwater management goals. A new program here, and I'm excited to partner with the Department of Conservation, as well as Department of Water Resources, the State Water Resources Control Board, and Fish and Wildlife, at a multi-benefit land repurposing program. $50 million is proposed for this program to really look at how do we reduce or eliminate groundwater pumping where that is most appropriate, or repurpose this ag land that has been irrigated ag land to achieve other important benefits for the community and for the environment and for habitat. We also know that a reality of our life is that there will be an increase in invasive pests that will be a part of climate change. And so this budget includes $10 million for invasive species projects that would be recommended by the Invasive Species Council. And then finally, near and dear to my heart is continuing our work on our farmer equity programs, $10.4 million for small and historically underserved farmers and ranchers to really help them rebound from the disruptions that they've had and to provide technical assistance so they can access USDA programs as well as our CDFA grants. And finally, a new program $10 million being dedicated to working with the farm worker community and others for a new beginning farmer program and a farm manager apprenticeship program. And with that, I'll turn it back to Lauren, or if Secretary Crowfoot is on, I'll turn it over to Secretary Crowfoot.
Hey, thanks so much. It's great to be with you. You know, we do this a couple times a year, and I have to say this moment feels different. You know, on the one hand, the climate crisis has never been more severe, and I think has come more urgently and intensely than any of us thought. So many of us who worked in this space for the last couple decades anticipated the impacts that we're seeing now, decades into the future. At the same time, I want to be hopeful and sort of, you know, on building on Lauren and Jared and Karen and Nuantara in just a moment. It feels different because, you know, we have political leadership in Sacramento between the governor and the legislature who is focused like a laser on doing what we need to on climate change. You know, if you haven't had a chance to see Governor Newsom's press conference today, you know, he chose to be up in Sequoia National Park in front of the giant sequoias, highlighting the climate portion of the budget, given the intense focus he has on this, particularly given just how much of a crisis we're in. And just so grateful to have the team that we have. And Lauren, huge thanks for framing this whole discussion in such compelling and personal terms. I'm just going to take a short time to highlight some really big numbers across mostly the resilience side of our climate action, starting with wildfire. Over $1.5 billion allocated this year to build our wildfire resilience. That's beyond all of the funding we're doing to respond to wildfires. These are upfront proactive actions. You probably know that almost $500 million was allocated in April in an extraordinary way by the governor and legislature in an early action budget. Very glad to report that 85% of that amount of money has been awarded and committed and is turning into projects on the ground as we speak. An additional $988 million, almost $1 billion more was allocated by the governor through signing today. And that's really going to be spent, as we talk about it, in three concentric circles: within communities to build resilience, home hardening, defensible space, evacuation planning, community initiatives; around communities, specifically fuel breaks that slow fire down as it enters to communities and gives firefighters a chance to make a stand, like they did successfully in South Lake Tahoe earlier this summer. And then broadly across our landscapes, ecologically based landscape management to bring our landscapes, our forests back into health through prescribed fire, certain ecologically based vegetation management. It's remarkable, historic amount of spending, all being spent through a framework of this action plan that we have, the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan in January. 99 specific actions integrating federal government, local government, tribal governments, civil society, RCDs, et cetera. So while the wildfire crisis is obviously severe, I'm really gratified with the amount of resources we have and the intense focus that we're putting to get those resources working quickly. Another big chunk of funding that we talked a little bit about is on drought, flooding, and water resilience. You know that we established this water resilience portfolio to help regions across the state build their water resilience. The governor legislature's budget will allocate $5.2 billion of new funding in both into emergency drought response and broader long-term water resilience. That's everything from emergency water to $500 million for water agencies to implement near-term projects to build their water supplies. There's tens of millions of funding to allow Fish and Wildlife to go out there and protect imperiled fish and wildlife from the drought. And it's longer term resilience investments really in Cal EPA and Water Board on water recycling, stormwater capture, and of course, conservation and efficiency. While it's a dry period, flooding is never too far from our mind, given climate change's impact on intensifying these winter atmospheric rivers and flooding. So over $600 million allocated in this budget for flood management and multi-benefit floodplain expansion. Extreme heat is a threat that is absolutely present across the state, particularly in vulnerable communities. Really excited that we've identified collectively with the legislature $800 million to tackle extreme heat. That includes urban greening, expanding air conditioning heat pumps in homes, and then setting aside a portion of that funding to be spent once our extreme heat framework is developed and finalized by the end of the year. Sea level rise, storm surge, obviously a huge priority for the legislature and governor, another over $600 million to protect infrastructure and ecosystems along the coast and allow for community planning along the coast. You know, from where I sit at our Natural Resources Agency, I think it's easy to say this budget invests more in nature than any other general fund in the past. We calculate about $1.3 billion in multi-benefit, what we call nature-based solutions, following up on an executive order that the governor had. This is not only going to help us build more climate smart land management strategies as we release a strategy on climate smart land management this year, but it's also going to help us make progress towards our goal to conserve 30% of California's land and coastal waters by 2030, the so-called 30 by 30 effort. Excited that a large portion of that funding is going to our Wildlife Conservation Board, as well as our conservancies, who are key implementers across the state. I'll lastly say, as I think New Antara is going to elaborate on, is all of this work is driven by science. In other words, science-based management. And I'll highlight the funding of the 5th climate assessment in California, which I believe we're the only state that actually invests year after year in scientific studies to understand how planetary climate change impacts California and what we need to be doing about it. So in all of this resilience work, we're going to continue to build our understanding of science and the impacts of climate from a scientific perspective. Really exciting work. And let me turn it back over to New Antara Key, who helps lead resilience efforts at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research.
Thank you so much, Secretary Crowfoot, and hello to everyone who is here with us today. I'm New Antara Key, Deputy Director for Climate Resilience in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And I want to thank the Governor, the legislature, and all our partners across the state for all the hard work to get to this historic day. This year's unprecedented investments in climate resilience will contribute to realizing the vision that every Californian live in a healthy, equitable, and resilient community. And building resilience to climate change while making a transition to a carbon neutral economy requires investment in capacity at the local, regional, and state level. So the $3.7 billion climate resilience package makes investments that align economic resilience with the state's climate goals, strengthen the leadership capacity of regional and local partners, and places low-income and disadvantaged communities, often the hardest hit by climate change and other health and economic challenges, at the forefront of community-driven climate resilience efforts. Specifically, the Community Resilience Package includes an unprecedented investment in over $800 million across 3 years to truly advance California's equity-driven climate agenda by investing in place-based initiative, building community capacity, and scaling deployment of actionable tools to guide equitable and resilient investments. This investment includes $420 million over 3 years for the Transformative Climate Communities Program, or TCC. And TCC funds place-based, sustainable, community-driven, catalytic projects in the most disadvantaged communities of California. The package also includes $20 million over 2 years for the Regional Climate Collaboratives Grant Program. And these grants will provide foundational investments in collaboratives of multidisciplinary partners to enable under-resourced communities the ability to build the capacity to create and advance community-led resilience and equity goals. In addition, the package includes $5 million in actionable climate science. Building on what Secretary Crowfoot said earlier, this funding will support scaling of our office's adaptation program through investments in actionable tools, including a statewide vulnerable communities platform, enhanced resources to deploy climate data in decision-making, and support better state coordination on climate science, all of which underpin state resilience investments. Next, this package includes $25 million over 3 years for climate adaptation and resilience planning grants through our adaptation program at OPR. These grants will help fill local, regional, and tribal funding needs, provide communities the resources to identify their climate priorities, and support the development of a pipeline of climate resilient infrastructure projects across the state. And finally, this package also includes nearly $250 million for a new regional climate resilience planning and implementation program at OPR. And these grants will support regional scale climate adaptation planning and implementation needs that address the most pressing climate risks within regions, with a particular focus on addressing the needs of the most vulnerable communities. And these investments complement, in this community resilience package, I just want to highlight, complement the investments to Cali PA's Environmental Justice Initiative, which Secretary Blumenfeld covered, as well as the investments going to conservancies that Secretary Crowfoot just spoke about. So now turning to the heat package that was also discussed earlier, I want to highlight two funding programs in that exciting package. The first is $100 million over 2 years for the Community Resilience Centers grant program at the Strategic Growth Council. With these funds, grants will fund community efforts to build new facilities or retrofit existing ones that can serve as centers to help communities withstand the impacts of extreme heat, wildfire, power outages, flooding, and other emergency situations brought about by climate change. And the second investment funding that is coming through this package is to OPR for a new community resilience and heat grant program to fund projects that reduce the impacts of extreme heat and the urban heat island. And finally, building again on Secretary Crowfoot's message on the importance of climate science, this budget includes $22 million investment in California's 5th climate change assessment, implementing the state legislature's direction through Senate Bill 1320. And this investment demonstrates the state's commitment to go beyond just investing in research, but extends into funding partnerships that accelerate the translation of science into policy and implementation actions. And the California climate assessments are much more than just an academic study. They're a portfolio of critical and cutting-edge data, research, and actionable tools that underpin state and local resilience efforts. So to implement this investment, we're building out a collaborative and multi-agency team across OPR, our office, the Strategic Growth Council, the Natural Resources Agency, and the Energy Commission to implement this truly integrated investment in actual climate science. So with that, I want to say thank you, and I will hand it back over to Lauren.
Thank you so much, Nuantara, Secretary Crowfoot, Secretary Ross, Secretary Blumenfeld, for all of your heartfelt remarks about our, Karen, to steal your phrase, once in a generation budget and opportunity to invest in our communities and future-proofing California. I now want to turn to our colleague, Erin Curtis, who will be teeing up some Q&A. Over to you, Erin.
Thanks, Lauren. We'll get to as many of these questions as we can. And of course, we'll be communicating with you offline if we aren't able to get to all of them. Just want to make that clear up front. First question is really about how we're going to get this funding out the door through existing programs or new programs, and if we have any estimate as to when those things are going to start to happen.
I mean, I would say broadly, the direction we have from the governor's office and Department of Finance is to expedite the getting this funding out and working. We obviously have to do that in a way that ensures the effective use of the funding. But I can tell you that we're really excited on the agency side that entities work so quickly to get that almost $500 million out the door in early action funding, 85% of which is committed. And then as an example, the Water Board and Department of Water Resources have already provided funding to small water agencies in need based on funding approved, I think, over the summer. So I think it differs by program, but you should know that we're working hard to figure out how we get this out as quickly as possible. Is that fair, Lauren and Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Wade. I do want to give Matt the mic, our fearless leader from our Department of Finance, helping us really make these budget investments happen. Matt, there are a few questions in the chat teed up about kind of budget 101 and what happens next.
And I think Wade actually characterized it very well. as you could see with these investments, there's a very broad suite of a lot of different programs. Some of them actually are, a lot of them, quite frankly, are existing programs where there's already a structure in place. And I think we could say with confidence, everything Wade just said, that we can get those monies out the door, specifically those immediate needs in the wildfire space, as well as drought and water. There's other programs that are new, and that for those new programs, those will require a process to develop guidelines. There'll be a public process. And so those will take a little bit longer. But as Wade mentioned, we want to make sure that this money is spent effectively as well. And that's the whole purpose of that public engagement. And in addition to that, as you can see, this is a multi-year plan as well. And so there's still some decisions to be made in future years in terms of the specific allocation of certain set-asides like extreme heat and nature-based solutions. And so there'll be a process in place for more specific allocation. So to kind of summarize, there's a spectrum of dollars that are being spent immediately on existing programs that will go out the door quickly. Some dollars being appropriated now for new programs that will take time for some guidance, and then some more out-year conversation. So it's a little bit of a spectrum there. Hopefully that answers the question.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Next question is related to electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and what are we doing and what's in these packages to beef up our charging?
Lauren, do you want to take that one?
Happy to, Jared. Charging infrastructure is getting charging infrastructure deployed across the state is critical to electric vehicle adoption. A lot of that is led by our great partners, CEC, over in Wade's shop. Jared highlighted the $4 billion ZEV budget and highlighted a lot of our great vehicle programs, cleaning up passenger vehicles and trucks and tractors. But there's also additional funding in that package specifically dedicated to charging infrastructure. There's $415 million for infrastructure just for medium and heavy duty vehicles, turning over our most polluting trucks, driving through disadvantaged communities, and then another $500 million to the CEC's Clean Transportation Program, deploying charging infrastructure for all vehicle fleets. Again, with great historic success in getting charging infrastructure into our disadvantaged communities. So a lot of work to be done in getting the chargers installed and enabling our ZEV goals of the future.
All right, thanks, Lauren. Next question talks about the Climate Smart Ag program and whether it will address carbon sequestration of eelgrasses or only terrestrial farming.
Now, this is, in fact, pasture land, grazing land, and grasses with deep roots are going to be an important part of the solution here. And so we have an existing Healthy Soils program that we have ranch land enrolled in that. And so we want to continue to advance that work and try to expand it as much as possible. I'd also like to call out that part of the reality with the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is some of those lands that may not be suitable for ongoing irrigation could qualify under the Multi-Benefit Land Repurposing Act to go into grasslands, and grasslands are a wonderful way of sequestering carbon. So when we think about these lands, we have to think about carbon banking, we want to think about water banking, we want to think about habitat, and we also want to be very mindful of economic impacts to these communities at the same time.
Thank you, Secretary Ross. I think the next question is also for you and fairly similar. When does CDFA expect to begin accepting applications for SWEEP and Healthy Soils?
In about 2 weeks. That's on the SWEEP side of it, because obviously we have a lag in being able to hire enough people under the terms that we have, but we are teed up and ready to start these programs sooner rather than later. And we will be phasing those out, but they will be some rolling application times to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to access these programs. We already have the technical assistance in place to be able to help people make their applications.
Great. Thank you, Secretary Ross. A number of you are asking about where you can find more specific numbers. There was a link in the stakeholder invitation to where this has been posted at the Department of Finance, and we're pulling it and we'll put it into the chat here as well. I just wanted to make that clear. We'll move on to the next question. Looks like this one's for you, Wade. The question is, what's your reaction to and commitment to address the findings of top forests and climate scientists, the information that came out in the IPCC report regarding thinning of the forests and its impact on carbon releases? Says looking to do more to protect public forests as natural carbon sinks and stores.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'll refer to the climate smart land management strategy that we're developing this year. And clearly we need our working and natural lands to be carbon sinks and not carbon sources. We have a huge problem in our forests right now because our forests and frankly our wildlands across the state have historically sequestered a whole lot of carbon and continue to do that. The challenge is when we have these catastrophic wildfires, we're seeing a lot of net increase in emissions, as well as toxic air quality that harms public health, particularly vulnerable people. So that the question in my mind is, what are the strategies that we need to employ to improve land management to ensure that our landscapes maximize carbon removal, carbon sequestration, and minimize becoming a source of carbon pollution. So I think the questioner is asking, what is the role of so-called vegetation management in the carbon cycle, and is that does that improve carbon management, or does that reduce the ability to sequester? I think from our perspective, we are clear that we need to reintroduce prescribed fire onto the landscape to allow for low-level fire, in part to reduce the size of these wildfires that are happening right now. Obviously, wildfire is part of our natural ecology, but it's been suppressed for a century. And so the more of it that we can do, frankly, the better. Also, though, ecologically based vegetation management, thinning, for example, in shaded fuel breaks around communities, we think is important, not only to protect the communities, but to reduce small or medium-sized fires from growing larger. But generally speaking, this is a topic that we'll take on in the climate smart land management strategy. There'll be an opportunity for the public to actually share input on that draft strategy very soon.
Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot. Next question, can you say more about the heat set-aside funds? Will you propose spending some next year? And if so, how does that work with the timing for the heat framework document?
Yeah. Matt or Lauren can jump in if I get this wrong, but I think I'm getting it right, which is we're updating the state's extreme heat framework, which was established in 2013 in real time right now this year. And we expect to have the framework done by the end of the year. And we wanted that framework to be done to really inform at least a part of the investments we're making in extreme heat. So I think there's an open question, Matt, about whether we would be making specific recommendations based on that framework in January or April, but certainly soon after the framework is complete.
Yes, thank you, Wade. Wade couldn't have said it better. I think if you look at what the administration's done, both in terms of the wildfire action, the forest action plan, the water resilience portfolio, those guiding action plans and principles that are in that ended up informing and guiding the investments that are in package as well as water. So that allows us, these are big dollars, but by having that action plan, it allows the dollars to be spent strategically. And so we want to kind of build on the success of those action plans in the urban heat, or excuse me, the extreme heat space. And then once that action plan is done, that will then inform our January package in terms of investment strategy. So everything Wade said, I think, well stated.
All right. Thank you, Matt. Next question. Let's see. Pardon me. There's several questions about whether or not some of what's included in the package is going to require additional legislation, and whether investments are going to be outlined in the Jan 10 budget for next year.
Let me take a stab at that, and apologies if this gets a little bit budget wonky, but I think it's important to kind of put some of these dollars into two different buckets. The first bucket is what you would call baseline buckets, which is to say that every year there's an annual budget act, but dollars are built into the baseline in that budget act, and usually again, it's considered part of the baseline. So even though the legislature acts on it, it's built in and assumed as our baseline assumptions. Many of the out year numbers that you see in here will essentially be part of the baseline budget. And so you can view those as being built in. There's another bucket of items which are the set-asides, and that's what we talked about earlier, which is like the extreme heat. Those have not been programmed yet. Those have not been built into any baselines. I think what we're doing here is we're kind of setting aside an allocation in the out years and saying, this is the overall amount of money that we want to commit to these areas. But as in extreme heat, we want to make sure we take the time to be strategic about how we make those investments. So we will be coming back in January asking for legislative action on a specific investment structure-based solutions in sea level rise, in extreme heat, that will build on these action plans and strategies that have been just outlined. Hopefully that makes sense.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions related to SB 55 and what happened to the climate resilience funding that was in that bill.
Yes, thank you, Erin. I did check in with our ledge team because I thought this question would come up. So SB 155 is the resources trailer bill. And maybe just to back up, there are 700 bills on the governor's desk right now. And as you all know, just as well as we do, it is a sprint to get those all signed and enacted. And it's a great problem to have. He took action on a number of kind of climate bills, including the budget trailer bill this morning, but we are not done on climate bills or 155. So just because we didn't sign it and press it today doesn't mean it's not getting signed. Very much look forward to hearing from you all on those bills and working with you on their implementation.
Thank you, Laura. Next question might be for you, Wade. Will there be an effort to educate Californians about conserving resources?
Yeah, absolutely. In real time. I mean, in all manner of resources. So as you may know, the governor has asked Californians to reduce their water usage by 15%, given the drought that we're now in. We're amping that campaign up through Save Our Water. And so if you could, Erin, have somebody just put in a link to Save Our Water. And that's, you'll see more paid media, in other words, advertising for water conservation in coming weeks, thanks to the approval of the budget, the legislature and the governor's approval of the budget. So that's really good on conservation. There's investments in this budget that continue to drive energy efficiency and conservation, which is really among the best in the country. Certainly, I would say the best in the country. So energy, water, and then I think broadly on environmental conservation, our 30 by 30 effort is focused on improving conservation on both natural and working lands, which we're really excited about. So from where we sit in the agency focused on conservation of resources, there have never been larger, more focused investments toward that end, and we're really excited about it.
Thanks, Secretary Crowfoot. And this one's probably more for Secretary Blumenfeld. What's the importance of educating the average Californian about where we are headed? And what are we going to do to accomplish that?
Yeah, so given the 429 people on this call, like all of you are part of this discussion of how we give people enough information, to actionable information, but also just information on, you know, how to get through the day, given the headlines that we get on our phones every 10 minutes. One of the ways that we're doing that is curriculum. So California is the first state in the nation to have an environmental K through 12 curriculum. And every public school in California now has that environmental education curriculum that focuses on everything from the issues that Wade was talking about on conservation and recycling and energy efficiency and water efficiency, all the way through the bigger issues of climate. And it's a really cool curriculum because it's integrated into the science and math and biology and history and the core curriculum elements. And so we can definitely talk more about that. And then I think we all have an obligation. When you look at polling, even in California, very few of us are having daily conversations with family, with relatives on climate. We all take it very seriously, but it isn't part of the kind of discourse of how we think about our daily lives. So I think, you know, we need to continue doing everything we can to engage on what I think for many people they feel is a very intimidating subject. Like, you shouldn't have to read the 4th climate assessment or understand what's in the 5th climate assessment or have a PhD or even understand what the acronym IPCC means in order to get what it means to be participating in things that we can do every day to reduce our emissions. But also just the issues around equity. I think some of the things we're coming out in 2 weeks with the final version of the 4.0 for Cal Enviro screen. I'd encourage people just to look. It's incredible to see how race is an issue that determines environmental outcomes in our state and pollution outcomes. And so how can we change that? How can we think about how we're going to do that differently? So I think we all have work to do. And I guess in the year ahead, what I would say is this budget is what the state's going to do, but what we're all really interested in, I think, Karen and Wade and Lauren and Erin and Nuantara and Matt and the whole team, how we engage with you to come up with some solutions where we're leveraging each other. It can't just simply be about what we're doing alone in our silos. So that's really the purpose of having a conversation today, is engage in that discussion and say, we all need to up our game and do more. That's what the governor's shouting at Karen and Wade and myself, not shouting, but emphasizing strongly. And Lauren tells us too, every time she speaks with him, like, need to be doing more, need to educate more people. So yeah, it's a great question. And I think let's come together between now and, as Matt said, Jan 10, and think on public outreach and education, what more we can do.
Thank you, Secretary Blumenfeld. And we're at the top of the hour, so that's our last question. I'll just let folks know that we'll do our best. I know there were some very specific questions in the Q&A as well, and we'll do our best to try to get back to those of you who have those questions and respond individually. Thank you very much for your attention for the last hour, and we look forward to working